They told the townspeople never to go near the Calder farmhouse after dark. But they never said why. Not in public, at least. The truth lived in whispers, passed between trembling lips, traded like contraband knowledge under the breath of night. If you stood close enough to the old well behind their house, you could hear something moving below the surface, and it didn't sound like water. It's 1928, a quiet patch of southern Missouri where the map fades into forest. No electricity, no outsiders, just a handful of families, and one name that no one dared speak above a whisper: Calder. They weren't just strange, they were wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't come from madness or sin, but from blood. The Calder children were pale, almost translucent, eyes clouded like milk, faces stretched too long, fingers too thin, limbs that bent where bones shouldn't. And yet, their family insisted they were blessed, chosen, they'd say, by an ancient blood that must remain pure. No one married into their line because no one was invited. The Calders married themselves, brother to sister, father to daughter. Generation after generation, their blood spiraled inward until something inside began to rot. When the traveling surveyors first arrived that spring, they said the forest near the Calder property felt wrongly alive. The air thick, the ground too soft. One man joked that it was like walking on lungs. 2 days later, that same man vanished, and his body was never recovered. But the strangest part wasn't their disappearance. It was the journal found near his tent. One page soaked through with moisture, yet still legible. It read, "They have a church in the cellar. They pray to themselves." The sheriff burned that page. And the next morning, the well behind the Calder farmhouse was sealed with iron. Tonight, I'll tell you what was inside it. Not the rumor, not the myth, the truth, the one that historians erased. Because once you understand what happened in that valley, you'll start to see the same pattern in every institution that controls you today. And after that, you'll never look at family or blood the same way again. Before the Calder name turned into a curse, it was a legacy. A name whispered among the earliest settlers of Missouri's southern ridge. Not for wealth, but for purity. Thomas Calder, the patriarch, arrived in 1821 with a belief that he was carrying the blood of angels. He told his children that their veins carried a fragment of divine essence, a secret lineage that must never be diluted by outsiders. It sounds like madness now, but you have to understand, isolation does things to the mind. When the world outside is filled with chaos and war, the promise of sacred blood feels like a kind of order. And that's how it began, a doctrine of purity wrapped in the language of God. The Calders built a wooden chapel beside their home, though no priest ever entered. They had their own scripture, written by Thomas himself, in a book of cracked leather they called the Line of Grace. Inside were 27 commandments, none found in the Bible. One read, "To mix the divine with the ordinary is to murder heaven." It began as ideology. It ended as a breeding manual. By the time the second generation was born, brothers took their sisters as wives. Fathers became grandfathers twice over through the same daughter. Each child bore the burden of devotion, or what they believed was devotion. Because that's how corruption always works. It disguises itself as faith, as loyalty, as love. Neighbors began to whisper about strange lights at night, songs that echoed from beneath the ground. Women seen weeping near the stream, their faces hidden by cloth. No one dared confront the Calders directly. The last man who did, a local preacher, returned from their property with his tongue missing. He never spoke again. The state ignored them. The law stayed away. And so the Calder name grew in silence, like rot beneath old paint. But if you trace their letters, their transactions, and the few surviving court documents, a darker truth emerges. The Calders weren't just preserving blood. They were transforming it. Thomas believed his bloodline would awaken something ancient, a divine correction to mankind's decay. And that belief, passed down like a holy infection, would soon turn an entire valley into a human experiment, hidden behind the illusion of faith. By 1852, the Calder farmhouse had swollen into a compound, half home, half shrine. Outsiders called it the house with no windows, because every visible pane had been boarded from within. At night, a dim amber glow leaked from the cracks between the planks. No one knew what burned inside, oil, candles, or something else. That year, the county registrar recorded 3 deaths on the Calder property, all infants. Each death certificate listed the same cause: congenital failure of the spine. The midwife who signed them later left town without a trace. But before she vanished, she told her sister one sentence that survived in local lore: "They aren't burying their dead, they're planting them." It sounds poetic until you realize she meant it literally. The Calders had begun a new ritual, one described in fragments inside the line of grace. When a child was born imperfect, its body was returned to the soil behind the chapel. There, the family believed the blood would return to its source and strengthen the next generation. They called it the reclamation. By the 3rd generation, the family's features began to change. Their eyes lightened to near white, their pupils almost invisible in daylight. Their voices lost resonance, flat, whispering, like air escaping through wood. The children stopped aging normally. Some grew tall too quickly, others not at all. The townspeople said they looked half-carved, half-born. Medical men from Jefferson County came once, 2 young doctors seeking fame by documenting rural deformities. They left before sundown. One of them, Dr. Alcott, later wrote in his private notes, "They call their sickness a gift. They believe they are becoming pure enough to see what others cannot." The line between ritual and mutation had dissolved. What began as theology had turned into biology, guided by the arrogance of a single idea: that purity must outlast humanity itself. And here's the part no historian dares to print. The Calders weren't alone. Letters recovered from the compound mention the benefactors, a circle of men in St. Louis who provided supplies, tools, and medical texts in exchange for the results. So ask yourself, when faith becomes experiment and experiment becomes inheritance, what kind of world do we create? Because the Calder story wasn't a warning, it was a prototype. When the state finally intervened, it wasn't because of morality, it was because of noise. In the spring of 1861, loggers working 2 miles east of the Calder property reported metallic sounds coming from underground, like chains dragged across stone. They said it echoed for hours, even after midnight. The sheriff called it old pipes, but by autumn, the noise spread across the valley. The earth was breathing. A small team of state investigators arrived. 4 men and 1 woman, sent from Jefferson City under the pretense of land assessment. They carried notebooks, lanterns, and a quiet arrogance that only outsiders have. By dusk, they reached the Calder Gate, a rusted arch of iron marked with a strange sigil, something between a serpent and a halo. No one greeted them. The door stood open. The air inside smelled of oil, vinegar, and something sweetly rotten. Every surface was carved with lines, not symbols, just grooves, thousands of them, like a language that forgot itself. The deeper they went, the more the grooves thickened, until the walls looked alive, pulsating faintly under the lamplight. Then they found the chapel. It wasn't above ground, as records had suggested. It was below, reached through a narrow passage hidden behind a false hearth. The steps descended 40 feet. At the bottom, they found the pews, but each was occupied by mannequins made of wax and hair, dressed in the remains of Calder family garments. Faces melted, eyes replaced with buttons. Each figure had a name carved into its chest, the same names listed in the Calder family registry. In the center stood an altar, if you could call it that, a table of limestone, cracked and darkened by what looked like burns. Embedded in its surface were bones, hundreds of small ones, fused by heat. Infant bones. The investigators fled before dawn, but two never made it back. Their bodies were found days later near the stream, skin blistered, eyes missing, and mouths full of soil. The woman, the one who survived, never spoke publicly again. But decades later, her granddaughter would describe the recurring dream she had as a child. A church where the walls breathe and the floor hums your name. The state sealed the report. The sheriff was reassigned. The Calder name was removed from all official records. But silence doesn't kill a story like this. It feeds it, because every secret buried under government seal becomes more than myth. It becomes policy. By 1893, the Calder name had vanished from maps, census lists, and property ledgers. Erased so thoroughly that even local graves bore no markers. Yet whispers of their blood still moved through the region, passed down in the form of Calder children, pale infants born to unrelated families. The doctors called it coincidence. The locals called it inheritance. That same year, a new institution appeared less than 30 miles from where the Calder farmhouse once stood. The Mercy Hill Institute for Hereditary Study. Its founder, Dr. Leonard Voss, was a man with government ties and an obsession with genetic purification. His mission: to identify and isolate families with unique physiological anomalies for medical preservation. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because the first 10 subjects brought into Mercy Hill were all children born from the surrounding valley, each showing traits eerily consistent with the old Calder bloodline. Colorless eyes, translucent skin, abnormal bone growth, and unsettling intelligence. Voss called them living proof of divine concentration. The files were classified under Experiment Series 7A. Most of those files were later destroyed, but a surviving assistant, decades later, confessed that Voss had been corresponding with a private benefactor group. The same group had once supplied the Calders with surgical tools and medical texts. Their letterhead read only 3 words: the order of renewal. Voss's records reveal that the Calder family wasn't a mutation. It was a template, a controlled bloodline, shaped through selective breeding, designed to explore the boundaries of human sanctity. Their doctrine of purity had been seeded decades earlier by the very men who would later pioneer eugenic science. The Calders weren't mad. They were following orders. And the strangest part? Mercy Hill's architecture mirrored the original Calder farmhouse, right down to the windowless chapel in its sublevel. A reconstruction of the same cellar where the investigators once stood. Only this time, the state funded it. The last remaining Calder descendant, a woman named Esther, was documented in 1896 as Specimen Zero. She lived in a sealed ward for 12 years, aging at one-third the normal rate. Her mind reportedly unstuck from sequence. When she died, her final words were written phonetically by a nurse. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. That sentence appears again, decades later, in a classified medical paper, under a different name. Project Eden. The nurse had wrapped the second infant in a blue cloth and held him away from the light. The doctor whispered, "They must never see each other in the same mirror." The general, strong, proud, unshaken by war, felt something cold move through his chest. That night, when the lamps were dimmed and the storm outside finally died, the midwife who had witnessed the birth looked into the nursery mirror and screamed. For in the reflection, there weren't two cribs, there was only one. And inside it, a pair of eyes, one bright, one shadowed, stared back as if belonging to a single child split in two. From that night on, every mirror in the mansion was covered with black cloth. But sometimes when the twins slept, the servants swore they heard soft knocking from behind the glass. The general told no one. He ordered silence and built a private wing in the house for the other child. But rumors began to spread in the nearby town, of candles flickering by themselves, of whispers behind the windows, and of a woman's sobs that seemed to echo from deep beneath the nursery floor. People said one of the twins wasn't born alive, but refused to stay dead. Months passed, and the mansion grew quiet, too quiet. Only one child was ever seen, the healthy twin, the one they called Lucien. He played in the sunlight, learned to speak, and laughed when his father entered the room. The servants adored him. The general, too, though something in his gaze always trembled. Because beyond the east corridor, behind a locked iron door, lay the other wing. The place no one entered. The place where the second cradle stood. Each night, the general visited it alone, candle trembling in his hand. He never spoke of what he saw there, but once a maid followed him in secret. She said she heard a heartbeat coming from a cradle that hadn't moved in months. And when she peered through the keyhole, she swore she saw Lucien's face staring back at her, only older, colder, and awake. The next morning, the maid was gone. Her room was found empty, her apron folded neatly on the floor. But the mirror in the nursery, once covered, was uncovered again, and written on it, in a child's uneven hand, were 3 words. "He is awake." After the maid vanished, no one dared speak her name. The mansion resumed its quiet rhythm, except for the nights when the wind howled through the hollow pipes beneath the floorboards. Some said it was the sea breeze. Others whispered it was him. The Calders had built their estate atop something older, tunnels from the war, or maybe older still, cut deep into the bedrock. Locals said those tunnels led to ritual chambers, places where soldiers weren't buried, but sealed. And every family that bought the land heard things that couldn't be explained. Crying, scratching, sometimes lullabies. One stormy night, Lucien followed the sound. Barefoot, candle trembling, he crept down the cellar stairs. The air grew thick, humid, metallic. The walls weren't stone anymore. They were carved with faces. Dozens of them, twisted in agony. And then he heard it, his own voice calling from the dark. "Lucien, come play." When the servants found him hours later, he was curled on the floor, shivering. His candle was out. His eyes were open, but he didn't speak for days. That night, the general ordered the cellar sealed with bricks. But those who laid the last stone said they could still hear something moving behind it. Something small, something breathing. Lucien began to change after that night. He wouldn't sleep in his bed anymore. He spent hours staring into the old mirror in the nursery, the one no one dared touch since the maid disappeared. Sometimes he whispered to it. Sometimes he laughed. And once his reflection didn't move when he did. The general called for doctors for Boston. They examined the boy, found nothing wrong. Imagination, they said. Stress. But when one of them reached to cover the mirror with a sheet, Lucien screamed. A sound so sharp the glass cracked across the center, splitting his reflection in two. The general dragged him away, but Lucien only kept whispering. He said he's almost ready. That night, something strange happened. Every clock in the house stopped at 3:13 a.m. The servants woke to footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the halls. The general burst from his room with a pistol, shouting his son's name. In the nursery, the mirror stood uncovered again. The crack was gone, and on the floor lay two sets of footprints, one leading in from the door, and another leading out of the mirror. By morning, the general locked the nursery forever. But even sealed behind wooden nails, they said you could still hear two children laughing, one with a voice that echoed, and one that didn't. A month later, the general's brother arrived from Charleston, a clergyman, stern and proud. He had come because of a letter, one written in the general's trembling hand. Something beneath this house remembers our name. I fear it knows what we've done. The brother dismissed it as madness until he found the Calder family journal. It wasn't kept with the other records in the library. It was hidden inside the wall behind the fireplace, bound in black leather, smelling of salt and iron. The pages told a history far darker than war or wealth. The Calders, it seemed, were not soldiers by legacy. They were keepers, bound to protect something buried generation after generation. One passage read, "The twin must never meet his reflection, for one is the vessel and one is the flame." Another page was worse. It described a ritual to preserve blood purity through marriage within the line. The brother realized then why so many Calder children were born strange, frail, or not at all. He confronted the general, shouting, "You've cursed this family with your silence." But the general only whispered, "I didn't start the curse. I just tried to contain it." Later that night, the brother fled the house. But before he left, he swore he saw two shadows in the upper window, identical, hand in hand, watching him go. By dawn, the general burned the journal on the hearth. But even as the flames consumed the pages, the ink bled through the smoke, and words began to appear on the mirror upstairs. 3 new ones this time. It's my turn. After the general's death, the mansion was sealed. The authorities came, of course, reporters, sheriffs, men of faith, but none stayed past sundown. The air inside felt wrong, charged like static before lightning. Every time someone entered, the house seemed to shift. Hallways longer, stairs steeper, portraits rearranged. The official report called it suicide by guilt. But those who'd seen the general's body whispered something else. His eyes weren't closed. They were open and glassy, as though he'd been staring at something that wasn't there. The estate passed to a distant cousin, a banker from New York. He came with architects, intent on restoring the mansion. But the workers refused to stay. They said the blueprints didn't match the reality. Rooms appeared that weren't drawn. Doors led to nowhere. And one mirror, the one from the nursery, always found its way back into the house, no matter how many times they removed it. After the third attempt, the banker nailed it shut behind iron bars. That night, thunder shook the valley. By morning, every window was shattered, except one, the nursery's. Locals began calling it the house that wouldn't die. Travelers who passed at night saw candlelight flickering behind the curtains. Some swore they heard children's voices singing softly, like a lullaby carried on the wind. And on a mansion's front door, scratched into the wood where no rain could wash it away, were 5 words. The bloodline is not done. By 1928, the Calder mansion had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. But blood has a way of finding its way home. The general's great-granddaughter, Evelyn Calder, arrived one autumn afternoon. A young historian with a pale face, educated in Boston, and driven by a strange obsession. She claimed she was writing a thesis on degenerative aristocracies, but those who met her said she looked too much like the portraits hanging in the old Calder Hall. Evelyn ignored the warnings. She reopened the house, swept away the dust, lit the fireplaces, and began cataloging the family's relics. But the deeper she went, the more the house seemed to respond. The clocks began to tick again. Candles lit themselves. And one night, while sorting through a box of the general's letters, she found a small silver key labeled only for the other one. That phrase chilled her. The next morning, she used it. It fit a door no one had mentioned in any of the house's blueprints. A narrow entrance at the back of the east corridor, hidden beneath torn wallpaper. The key turned. The door groaned open. Inside was a small room, untouched by time. 2 cradles side by side, draped in rotting white lace. Between them hung the cracked mirror. Evelyn raised her lantern and saw 2 shadows behind her. When she turned, no one was there. But in the mirror, the twins stood, small, pale, smiling. And behind them, her own reflection, whispering in her voice. You came back to finish it. That night, Evelyn's journal entry stopped. But neighbors said they saw candlelight burning for 7 nights straight. Until, one morning, it stopped forever. When the sheriff's men finally entered the Calder mansion weeks later, they said it smelled alive. Not of decay or mold, but of breath. The air pulsed. The floorboards seemed to move beneath their boots, expanding and contracting like lungs. Evelyn was gone. Her car was still outside, her bags still packed, her typewriter still warm, but she had vanished. What remained was a new set of footprints in the dust, small, barefoot, leading in circles around the nursery. The mirror was gone too. In its place, a dark, wet patch on the wall, the shape of a human body pressed outward, as if something had tried to escape from behind the plaster. They sealed the mansion that same day. No one dared step inside again. But those who lived near the woods claimed they could see faint candlelight flickering through the cracks at night. The same pattern that burned for 7 nights before Evelyn disappeared. Some said she'd become the mirror's next reflection. Others whispered she had joined the blood. But one man, a contractor hired years later to survey the property, reported something even stranger. Beneath the house, in the old servant tunnels, he found a second nursery, identical to the one upstairs, but with one detail changed. In this one, the name Evelyn was carved into the crib. The man quit his job the next morning. 3 days later, he was found wandering barefoot along the roadside, whispering a single phrase again and again. The house is breathing her name. That phrase, the house is breathing her name, would later become a symbol in Calder folklore, a warning of what happens when a bloodline calls back what should have stayed buried. Now I'll tell you something that most of the official records left out. The detail that links the Calder clan to something far older than any American name.
Before there was a Calder family, before the mansion, before the Civil War, before the name ever reached American soil, there was a different name. One buried in European archives, redacted from church records, whispered only among occult historians. They called them the Children of Calder, not a family, a sect. A group said to have practiced preservation of the divine line through blood, isolation, and ritual conception. Their belief that purity of lineage was the key to divinity, that if one could keep the blood unbroken, the human would evolve into something beyond flesh. These children appeared in 14th century France, then vanished after a series of Inquisition raids. But their writings didn't. They resurfaced centuries later in New England, hidden within private collections of early settlers, writings that mentioned a prophecy. The line shall cross the sea and find its mirror among the trees. When the blood returns to its home, the house shall breathe and none shall leave. Sound familiar? That verse was found engraved inside the Calder mansion, deep beneath the nursery wall, as if the family had been reenacting a ritual they barely understood. This wasn't just inbreeding. It was a continuation, a living ritual passed through centuries, meant to bind a family to something older than nations, older than God. Every time a Calder child was born, their bloodline tightened its own chain, closing the loop, erasing dilution, inching closer to whatever form of purity the children of Calder once worshipped. Evelyn's disappearance wasn't random. She was the final link, the closing of the circle. Her arrival completed the prophecy's final line. The blood returns to its home, and once that happened, the house didn't need her body. It needed only her blood. They say if you stand near the ruins today, because yes, the mansion finally burned, you can still hear something faint in the soil when the wind passes through the trees. A heartbeat, slow, rhythmic, ancient. The bloodline isn't dead. It's waiting. The official record says lightning struck the Calder estate on October 12, 1929. That's what the papers printed, lightning. But there were no storms that night. No clouds. No rain. Only silence and the faint smell of iron drifted through the valley. Locals saw it first. A glow behind the tree line. They said it didn't look like a fire at all. More like the air itself was burning. And when the first flames reached the roof, they didn't rise. They sank, curling downward, consuming the house from the inside out. By the time the fire crew arrived, the mansion was already half collapsed. But what made them turn back wasn't the heat. It was the sound. Witnesses described it as breathing, the same rhythmic, hollow exhale heard through the walls years earlier. The house wasn't burning, it was feeding. Every beam, every nail, every stone exhaled black smoke as if the walls themselves were sighing in relief. One firefighter claimed he saw faces inside the smoke. Two small children, a young woman, and behind them, a tall figure in a military coat, staring out from the collapsing window. He swore the man smiled before the roof caved in. The next morning, nothing was left but a circle of scorched earth and ash. Yet in the very center of that ruin, untouched by flame, lay a single object, the mirror. Not cracked, not burned, perfectly preserved. When authorities lifted it, they noticed something impossible. Faint condensation on its surface, like breath fogging glass. And when they wiped it clean, one word was revealed beneath the mist. Returned. No human remains were ever recovered. Not Evelyn's. Not the ancestors, not anyone's. Just the mirror. It was sealed and sent to a federal archive in Washington, where it was quietly classified under unexplained religious artifacts. But it didn't stay there long. In 1947, it vanished from storage. No break-in, no paperwork, just gone. Some believe the mirror was never an object at all. It was a doorway, one that finally closed. Others say it was taken, smuggled out by a collector who understood what it truly was. The Calder family's final breath. In 1951, 4 years after the Calder mirror vanished from government storage, it reappeared quietly, anonymously, at a private estate auction in New York. No provenance, no label, just a handwritten tag that read, Lot 77, silver-framed mirror, circa 19th century. It was purchased by a man named Dr. Leon Harrow, a reclusive collector of psychospiritual relics. He was once a military psychologist, rumored to have worked on secret government programs exploring mind influence, dream manipulation, and what he called mirrored cognition. Harrow believed certain objects acted as memory vessels, capable of storing trauma, intent, and even consciousness, a theory most called insanity. But he had proof, or so he claimed. When he acquired the Calder mirror, he wrote in his journal that it vibrated like something alive. Within weeks, his behavior changed. He stopped speaking to friends. He covered every other mirror in his mansion. And according to his housekeeper, he spent nights whispering to the glass, as if it whispered back. Then came the recordings. Harrow installed reel-to-reel equipment near the mirror, hoping to capture what he called psychic emissions. But what he caught wasn't static. It was breathing, slow, rhythmic, familiar. Over time, the sounds became clearer. A woman's voice murmuring half-sentences, a man's laughter, the cry of 2 children. Then, one night, Harrow himself vanished. The house was found locked from the inside, all windows sealed. The only clue was a tape left spinning on his desk, the reel nearly finished. In the final seconds, Harrow's voice can be heard whispering, "I see them. They're not behind the glass. They're inside me." After that, silence. When investigators arrived, they found the mirror once again covered in condensation, as though something had just exhaled through it. Her name was Margaret Vance, 23 years old. Quiet, meticulous, the kind of person who followed rules without question. She was cataloging a new batch of recovered artifacts for the government's Psychological Research Division, what later became known as Project Nemesis. The Calder mirror was never supposed to be part of her assignment. It was locked in a restricted room labeled BIO 77, but on the night of July 18, 1974, a storm cut power to the entire wing. Protocol dictated that all temperature-sensitive items be checked manually. Margaret, being new, volunteered. She entered the dark storage room with a flashlight, found the temperature regulator still humming, and then noticed something strange. A faint mist spilling from one of the sealed containers. It was cold. Too cold. The mirror. It was taken to a new facility, a federal archive in Maryland, under a different classification. Not artifact, not religious, but biological anomaly. And that's where it remained until 1974, when an intern accidentally looked into it. The containment glass had cracked, likely from the sudden power fluctuation. Her report later stated that she approached to inspect damage, but she didn't write what came next. Security footage shows she stumbled backward, dropped her flashlight, and screamed once. Short, sharp, cut off mid-breath. By the time guards arrived 2 minutes later, she was standing motionless, eyes open, face pale. She was alive, but changed. Doctors said she was in a state of profound catatonia. Yet brain scans showed something far stranger, an active dream cycle while awake. It was as if her consciousness had been hijacked by something inside her own mind. For months, she didn't speak. Then, during a psychiatric evaluation, she suddenly whispered 3 words, the only ones she ever said again. The blood remembers. Her pulse quickened whenever mirrors were nearby, and every night her body temperature dropped, precisely at the same rhythm as a human heartbeat. Margaret was transferred to a secure medical facility in Virginia. She died in 1983, but according to her final report, when the mirror was inspected after her death, a faint handprint appeared inside the glass, smaller than hers. They sealed the room, and for 40 years no one spoke the Calder name again. In 1988, a government investigator named Daniel Cross reopened the Calder case. Officially, it was part of a cold storage audit. Unofficially, he'd found something he was never supposed to see. Cross was a systems analyst, not a field agent. He was young, skeptical, and thought all the supernatural reports from the Cold War era were government paranoia. Until he read the Vance file. Margaret Vance's autopsy showed anomalies no medical textbook could explain. Cell structures with mirror-symmetric nuclei. In simple terms, her biology had changed direction, as though her body had tried to reflect itself from the inside out. Cross was fascinated. He requested access to BIO 77, claiming it was for data classification. They granted him a 1-hour window. That was enough. The first entry in his personal notes read, "The mirror hums. Low frequency, not sound. Something beneath hearing. It vibrates through bone." Over the next few nights, Cross returned, unlocking the archive under different credentials. He began noticing things. Reflections lagging behind his movement, condensation forming even in freezing temperatures, and a faint smell, iron and burnt sugar. Then the dreams began. He wrote, "They come as children first, always twins. They stand beside the bed whispering, 'You called us back.'" He stopped writing for a week. When he resumed, his handwriting had changed. Tight, precise, and the tone colder. His final entry, "It's not a mirror, it's a threshold. Every reflection it captures leaves a copy behind. Not on glass, but somewhere else." The Calders never died. They migrated. After that night, Cross vanished. His security badge was found melted, fused into the steel frame of the containment room. And once again, the mirror was gone. But here's where the story twists. Cross didn't just disappear. He reappeared. A month later, in a small town near the Missouri Ozarks, the original Calder land. Witnesses saw a man matching his description walking barefoot down a dirt road, whispering the same phrase Evelyn once wrote in her final note. "The house is breathing my name." It was after midnight when the storm began to gnaw at the edges of the mansion. Thunder rolling through the halls like an ancient beast. Henri, the general's loyal servant, was making his final rounds when he noticed something strange in the parlor. The large family portrait, the one commissioned on the twins' first birthday, had been slightly turned on the wall. He frowned. He had straightened it just that morning. But when he reached up to fix it, he froze. Because one of the twins in the painting, the darker-skinned boy, now had a faint smile. Henri staggered back, gasping. The other twin, pale and expressionless, stared blankly forward, just as always. But the other, the one who'd been buried months ago, was smiling faintly, like he was watching something only he could see. The general entered moments later, candle in hand. His face was tight, his eyes red from drink and memory. "What are you doing?" he snapped. Henri pointed, trembling. "Sir, the painting, it changed." The general's eyes went to the portrait, and for the briefest moment he saw it too, that ghostly, knowing grin. But he said nothing. Instead, he grabbed the servant by the collar. "You saw nothing," he hissed. "Do you understand?" "Nothing." Henri nodded, too terrified to breathe. When the general left, the servant looked once more. Both twins now stared straight at him. And on the table beneath the painting, though no window was open, lay a wet child's footprint. That night, the wind carried whispers through the mansion, a lullaby only the dead should remember. By morning, the storm had passed, but the mansion felt heavier, as if it had swallowed something it could not digest. The general locked himself in his study, refusing food or company. Henri avoided the parlor entirely. Yet in the servants' quarters, an old nurse named Agatha could not stay silent any longer. Agatha had served the family since before the twins were born. She had been there in the delivery room, had seen what no one else dared speak of. That night, she gathered two of the younger maids near the fire and whispered what she had kept buried for years. "They were born different," she said, "but not just in color. When the pale one came first, he didn't cry, not even once. His brother came second, dark as dusk, and the moment he breathed, the first one's eyes opened." The maids exchanged uneasy glances. Agatha went on, voice trembling. "The doctor told the general the second child wasn't natural. Said he was a reflection, a shadow the world shouldn't see. But the mother, sweet Madame Eloise, she refused to let them harm him. She said, 'He's the only one who feels alive.'" A floorboard creaked in the hallway. The women froze. Someone was listening. When Agatha turned, she saw a small shape standing at the door. A child. Pale, silent, watching. The candlelight flickered, and when it steadied again, the shape was gone. Agatha stood slowly, her breath sharp. She hurried to the general's study and knocked once, twice. No answer. When she entered, the painting of the twins was gone, and on the wall where it once hung were two small handprints, pressed deep into the wood, one light, one dark. By dusk, the mansion had become a hollow shell of whispers. Every corridor seemed to echo with footsteps that didn't belong to the living. The general, pale and shaken, ordered every servant to search the estate for the missing painting. Yet no one dared to enter the west wing, where the twins' nursery once was. Henri finally gathered the courage to go alone. Lantern in hand, he climbed the spiral staircase, its iron rail still cold from the storm. Dust fell like ash from the ceiling, and the old portraits seemed to watch his every step. When he reached the nursery door, he noticed something strange. Faint humming, like a child's lullaby, seeping through the cracks. The melody was slow, deliberate, the same song their mother used to sing. Henri pushed the door open. The painting stood against the wall, but it wasn't as it used to be. The two boys inside had changed. The pale twins' eyes were now open, wide and terrified, and the darker twin was gone from the canvas entirely. Only a faint, smoky outline remained where he once stood. Henry's lantern flickered, and a shadow crossed the floor, small, swift, like a child crawling just out of sight. He turned sharply. "Who's there?" A whisper answered from behind the cradle. "You shouldn't have looked." The lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. When the servants found Henri hours later, he was on his knees before the painting. His hair turned completely white, and on the wall behind him, where the painting hung, two small shadows lingered, neither belonging to Henri.
For 3 nights after Henry's collapse, the Calder mansion remained locked in silence. The general forbade anyone from entering the nursery again, but the servants whispered that the house itself had started breathing, slow, uneven, like something buried deep beneath its foundations was trying to wake. At midnight, the floorboards began to creak in patterns. Not random, rhythmic, like a message in code. One of the maids, Ruth, pressed her ear to the wooden planks and swore she heard children laughing below, muffled by soil and stone. By morning, she was gone, her bed still warm, her shoes still neatly by the door. The general, breaking under the weight of his own dread, ordered the west wing sealed. But Henri, now hollow-eyed, his sanity barely tethered, refused to leave it alone. He told his father they're not gone. They're underneath. That night, while thunder tore the sky apart, Henri pried open the nursery floorboards. The smell hit first, damp, metallic, rotten sweetness. Beneath the boards was a crawl space no one had ever known existed. He lowered a candle into the darkness and saw them. Tiny handprints pressed into the dirt. Dozens of them, too many for 2 children. Some are fresh, still glistening. All the lignes creuseurs. The air was thick and humming, like the low vibration of a trapped voice. He whispered, "What do you want from me?" The answer rose through the boards, a dozen voices at once, speaking as one. To remember what they did. The candle died. When the servants found him at dawn, Henri was sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor, muttering the same phrase over and over. It wasn't just us. It was the others before. And when they followed his gaze to the cracked floorboards, they saw new handprints forming in the dust. Small, vet, and still moving. Long before the Calders crossed the Atlantic, their bloodline carried a secret older than America itself. In a forgotten European village, records speak of a family so obsessed with lineage purity that they practiced rites beyond comprehension. A combination of alchemy, twisted faith, and blood magic designed to preserve a perfect reflection of the soul through generations. These were not ordinary humans. Their journals describe children born with echoes of previous ancestors, small, shadowed beings that carried memory, instinct, and emotion from the long dead. The villagers whispered that these children were half in the world, half in the grave, their very existence a bridge between the living and the dead. When the family fled Europe to the New World, they brought their rituals with them, hidden beneath the veneer of respectable ancestry. The Calder mansion, the nursery, the mirrors, all were designed to continue the practice. Every child born within the line was monitored, recorded, sometimes removed from their mother, sometimes encouraged to act as both sibling and parent to the next generation. It was a cycle of containment, a bloodline engineered not for survival, but for persistence, a persistence that demanded repetition, secrecy, and cruelty. The twins, the mirror, Evelyn, Henri, Margaret, all had been caught in this long chain, acting out patterns written centuries before they were ever born. The final warning was never meant for outsiders. It was written in the original European manuscripts, smuggled into the New World. The line shall not end until it is ready to see itself in full. Until then, It will reach through flesh, mirror, and shadow to call back what is owed. The Calder's obsession wasn't madness. It was inheritance. Every step, every disappearance, every whisper in the floorboards was a necessary repetition to preserve a continuity no one else could perceive. Long before the Calders crossed the Atlantic, their bloodline carried a secret older than America itself. In a forgotten European village, records speak of a family so obsessed with lineage purity that they practiced rites beyond comprehension, a combination of alchemy, twisted faith, and blood magic designed to preserve a perfect reflection of the soul through generations. These were not ordinary humans. Their journals describe children born with echoes of previous ancestors, small, shadowed beings that carried memory, instinct, and emotion from the long dead. The villagers whispered that these children were half in the world, half in the grave, their very existence a bridge between the living and the dead. When the family fled Europe to the New World, they brought their rituals with them, hidden beneath the veneer of respectable ancestry. The Calder mansion, the nursery, the mirrors, all were designed to continue the practice. Every child born within the line was monitored, recorded, sometimes removed from their mother, sometimes encouraged to act as both sibling and parent to the next generation. It was a cycle of containment, a bloodline engineered not for survival, but for persistence, a persistence that demanded repetition, secrecy, and cruelty. The twins, the mirror, Evelyn, Henri, Margaret, all had been caught in this long chain, acting out patterns written centuries before they were ever born. The final warning was never meant for outsiders. It was written in the original European manuscripts, smuggled into the New World. The line shall not end until it is ready to see itself in full. Until then, it will reach through flesh, mirror, and shadow to call back what is owed. The Calder's obsession wasn't madness. It was inheritance. Every step, every disappearance, every whisper in the floorboards was a necessary repetition to preserve a continuity no one else could perceive. If you think this is merely a story of ghosts, mirrors, and shadows, think again. Look in any reflection tonight. The next time you see a fleeting shadow behind a child, a glimpse in the corner of your eye, or a handprint that appears for no reason, remember the Calders. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some bloodlines never truly die. And some houses, even in ruin, still breathe. The Calder line, their mirrors, their shadows continue, waiting, watching, and remembering. And now, ask yourself, if the blood remembers, what part of it resides in you?